welcome back. I'm Dr. Bob Cargill, and we are delighted to have with us today Professor Seth Sanders of UC Davis. He is a highly decorated scholar. If you've never met him before, he is a winner of Guggenheim Fellowships, 2 NEH Fellowships, an NYU ISAW Fellowship, an Albright Institute of Archaeological Research Fellow. He's an Urbach Fellowship winner. He's the author of The Invention of Hebrew, From Adapa to Enoch. He's the author of a recent article. You should go check it out over in A&E today, called Who Really Invented the Alphabet? And of course, he is professor of religious studies at the University of California at Davis. Welcome, Seth Sanders.
Hey, thank you so much, Bob. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, we've been trying to get you here, and we're happy that you made the time. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk with us. Tell us, why did you want to become a scholar? What made you interested in scholarship?
Yeah, it was a little bit of an accident. I think I had wanted to be an artist, and freshman year in college, I was taking a drawing class, and I think I remember the teacher was kind of doing this stunt where he was like, "Oh, well, actually, I can write backwards. It's this trick I figured out." And I was like, "Oh, I can do that too." And he's like, "Shut up." And I got frustrated. Probably I had too much attitude too, and that. So I was like, you know what? I really like, J.D. Salinger and Franny and Zoe, all this mystical stuff about the Jesus prayer and Russian Orthodoxy and Zen Buddhism, and I'll study religion. That's much cooler. And then so I started taking religion classes and Bible classes, including with the great Frank Moore Cross, who was my first major Bible professor. And I was like, oh, I'll go into this because I have a Jewish background, so I should know all this stuff with Hebrew. And then there was a second kind of rude shock when I realized that there were these, people who'd in college and then in grad school who weren't Jewish, didn't grow up with Hebrew stuff around them, but just studied really hard. And maybe they were from rural Minnesota or Iowa, but they'd been to seminary and they knew Hebrew really well. And I didn't. My Hebrew sucked at that point. And so that was a useful kind of embarrassment, because I was like, okay, you just got to sit down and pay attention and really focus. And then this whole world opened up to me, and I got really, really committed to it.
So you just kind of found your way into it. It attracted you, and you were educated. Tell me again, where you went to school at Harvard?
Harvard undergrad, or I think I was the laziest student in John Hundergaard's Hebrew class. So this is a guy who at the time I think was maybe the world's greatest historical linguist in Semitic languages. And he was very nice to me, but he said he just remembered me like half asleep in class. But I got my act together enough to get a recommendation from, Frank Moore Cross. And then I went to grad school at Johns Hopkins. And then I studied for a year at Hebrew University with Jonas Greenfield of blessed memory. And then, did a postdoc at the U of Chicago. And then after a long period of struggling to find a job, I got one. Here I am.
Good. This is, and we are all the better because you became a scholar and got a job. And how do you like, well, let me ask it this way. Do you like doing research better, or do you like teaching better, or can you pull the two apart from one another?
Well, I think that for your emotional and intellectual health, as well as the health of your work, you need to have both in some dialogue, because the research, a lot of the research is this absolutely lonely, isolated thing. I have an idea. Does anyone else have it? Why didn't anyone else think of it? Only I have solved this riddle, that kind of business. And that's a mostly isolated struggle. to then improve your work, you have to have some dialogue with other colleagues, other people to improve the work or bounce it off of them, get new ideas. But to share it with people, to see how what it might mean to, regular human beings, you got to teach it at some point, because that's also when you find out what it means. Mm-hmm. Or whether it means anything to people, whether they get it. Often the stuff that might be most deeply meaningful or intriguing to a 20-year-old, or at Davis, we teach adult students as well. You might have a 40-year-old, 50-year-old, but to find out what it means to people, you kind of got to teach it.
Who invented the alphabet?
Well, it was this was a lady named Sarah. I wish the problem is really, this is kind of the problem, that we have no smoking gun. We have the earliest inscriptions probably around 1900, maybe 2000 BC. Although there's some new evidence that actually by my archaeology teacher at Johns Hopkins that might possibly push the date back another 500 years, which is, this is one cool thing about the field, is sometimes we think, we have no data. We haven't found anything new. And then, it's possible that someone will just be like, you know what? I published an article 5 years ago that upends everything. Right. So, and I'll talk about that. Is it really 500 years older than people thought? But, so we do know a few things purely based on the physical facts. We don't have any autobiographies. Nobody signed, I, Frank, invented the alphabet. What we do have, though, is some consistent patterns in all the early evidence that indicate, first of all, that the people who wrote it were speaking a West Semitic language. Mm-hmm. So that is a language that's ancestral to Hebrew, also to Arabic, Aramaic, those kind of languages. So, the word for goddess or great lady is Ba'alatu, which is taxonomically, it's definitively kind of a West Semitic root word. And we see that written there on a beautiful sphinx from an early period. So we know the kind of language they spoke. And we also, and this is the other crucial thing, we know that they had seen Egyptian and had got the idea, the general concept that you could draw a thing that would then let you make words and sounds out of it so you could send messages to people who weren't there. So it's kind of this first, great media invention. But the other thing, and this is really my main argument, is they don't show any sign that they actually understood Egyptian. This would be like if, the average American had not been raised in a place with writing, but saw a Chinese newspaper, or, someone from somewhere else just first came to America and the first thing they saw was English writing. And they're like, how do you guys do that? And this is what I think allowed it to be so creative, is that the inventors of the alphabet were not tied down to the way the Egyptian writing system worked. Egyptian writing is a rich, complex system. It works a lot like the way Chinese works today, or Babylonian did, which is that some of the signs can stand for whole words or concepts. Other signs stand for syllables, typically. Right. But that means that you have to learn quite a lot. You have to know a lot about the levels of the writing system in order to really do anything with it. Now, this doesn't mean it was impossible. In fact, again, if you look at ancient Egypt or a place like China today, just about everybody can read and write. It's not, you don't have to be a God level genius. You don't need 30 years of school. But the alphabet worked in a totally different way, which is rather than this rich, complex range of possibilities that you had to get. Is it a word? Is it a sound? In the alphabet, of course, each sign just stands for one sound. Mm-hmm. And so it's a kind of a more neutral way of representing language. And my theory, and this is not totally original, the first person to really argue this was a brilliant Egyptologist at Hebrew U named Orly Goldwasser. And around 2004, she first suggested that maybe these people were, what we would call illiterate.
Yeah.
Which at the time was very provocative, because the assumption among my dear departed colleague, Anson Rainey, is a notorious grouch, but a brilliant scholar, my current valued colleague, Christopher Ralston, who's probably the biggest authority on ancient Semitic epigraphy, they both think that this had to be a nerd, had to be a highly educated, sophisticated genius. And my answer to that is, well, it's still possible. But if this genius or group of geniuses who invented the alphabet were in fact educated and literate in Egyptian, they managed to conceal all evidence of that very carefully.
Right. And this is what's so provocative about your theory is, and I say this with all respect to my hometown, I grew up with individuals who I wouldn't say were illiterate, but were pretty non-literate. They really couldn't read or write past any second, third grade level. It's just there are still people in pockets in this country who can't really read or write, but they knew their letters. They knew what an A was, what a B was. They knew how maybe to write their name, but they weren't by any definition, a scribe or a scholar, but they knew what the letters were. I think they knew what the sounds they were supposed to make, and they just avoided writing unless they absolutely had to. And so your theory is compelling to me because it means that people can copy shapes to represent sounds without being a scribe or some kind of genius. And if we're not talking about composing literature, but we're just talking about shapes representing sounds or ideas, that sounds like it could work, could it not?
Yeah, I mean the other thing, there's two angles of evidence that show this. I think one is that all this stuff looks casual. It looks like graffiti. It looks relatively spontaneous or ad hoc. If you look at, and I have some illustrations in this Ancient Near East Today article, if you look at the earliest alphabetic inscriptions, they write the Aleph, that is the ancestor of our letter A, in multiple directions. One inscription, you'll find it in 3 different directions. It's as if you wrote your A upside down, knocked over on the left, knocked over on the right, every single way except the way we usually do it.
Right.
And this kind of casual, inconsistent way of writing is typical of people who know the shapes. They had someone teach it to them, maybe as a game,
right.
Kind of a novelty, but not people who were sitting there on their butts for 5 years being, yelled at to write it exactly the same way every time.
Right. I recall the idea of this argument that we have about grammar, about it being prescriptive or descriptive, and how does grammar evolve? Is it really a bunch of elite scribes dictating to us how grammar is supposed to be? And of course, that's what we learn in the school. Versus this descriptive thing of how is language actually used? Can you split an infinitive? Can you end a sentence in a preposition? Can you use the pronoun they to describe a singular individual, right? Can you spell things, orthography in a text message? And we all know exactly what's being said, even though it's not spelled in a proper way. The way that people use language is not always the proper way that the elites would teach us how to use it. And yet we get by just fine. Can that be applied to the alphabet itself?
That's actually a really nice way to look at it, because the kind of grammatical rules you learn in school, the kind that editors will try to remind you of when you're writing something, are often not the way people really use language. And the way people really use language is the engine of creativity and change. So just as an example, the whole reason that the English language sounds different from German is because of these sorts of historical linguistic changes that people naturally started doing things a little bit differently every generation. And English, the English of whatever, 1200 CE was pretty Germanic. It, as I recall, it had case endings, that is depending on its role in the sentence, the end of a word, like, a word for a kid or a dog or a house, would have a different ending depending if it was the one doing the action, having the action being done to them or for them. Those dropped off. Nowadays, we might call that lazy pronunciation. If you drop off the end of if someone says I instead of all right, you say, oh, you're being lazy. And it's like, yeah, if that's the case, then English was created by lazy people or laziness. But in fact, as you're saying, this is a great source of both change and creativity. And again, I want to flag the first person to lay this out in a rigorous way was Professor Goldwasser, based on her deep knowledge of Egyptian writing systems, as well as a careful look at the alphabet. And I think what I was able to add to this is pretty simple, but nobody had done it. Yeah. Which was to look at the sound value of every one of the early alphabetic characters. And there's a brilliant book also by a guy named Gordon Hamilton, who also studied with my teacher, Frank Moore Cross, on the development of the alphabet. Hamilton showed all the evidence for what Egyptian sign is most likely to have been the basis for what early letter of the alphabet. And one of the things that you can find out if you work through that whole book, all the data he's assembled, is that in no case was the way the alphabetic letter worked influenced by the way the Egyptian letter worked. Mm. So an example would be that the letter bet, which gives rise to RB, earlier the Greek beta, this is based on a West Semitic sound. The alphabet is all sort of acrophonic, just like USA or NBA. The way you would get the letter, the value for the letter B is you'd have something that looked like a word that began with B. And in this case, it's baitu, house, modern Hebrew bayit or biblical bayit. But in Egyptian, that has nothing to do with the B sound. It's only, it can be a word or a category for a dwelling, or it could be the Egyptian word for house, which is per, as in Pharaoh. And the P and the B don't have any close relationship linguistically. And that's true for every single letter. So in other words, in principle, that shows that you didn't need to know anything about how Egyptian worked. But the second piece of proof that I found almost shocking was that it was pretty clear that these folks were just looking at stuff on walls and they chose the name based on what it looked like, but not on how it even worked in Egyptian. So for example, if you look at the way they wrote B, it actually has two shapes. One is more of a curly shape. One is more of a, let's see, kind of like a Lego piece. Like it's like a box with a little hole in the bottom. And they used both for bait, for the B sound. In Egyptian, there's two totally different sounds. One is a sign for house. One's a sign for enclosure, like a cattle pen. And they did that similarly. There's a total of 6 different letters where they actually looked like they were randomly picking unrelated Egyptian signs. But they looked kind of the same to them. So again, once again, in theory, it's possible that an educated scribe who likes to do things consistently, who knows how things work, could have done this, and then deliberately fudged it, hid all the evidence, so that it looked like it was done by non-literate people. But to me, from the point of view of just forensically, it's like you're trying to solve a crime. Well, we think he committed suicide. Here's how he did it. He stabbed himself. then tied himself to a chair heroically, and then managed to get up to the window and jump out the window through this, sheet of bulletproof glass. And it's like, wow, that's a pretty smart suicide. Or it looked kind of more like he was murdered.
Right.
So that's the way I would argue it.
Yeah. No, I like I said, I think it's a compelling argument based on the evidence that you lay forth and the way that people, there are far more common people, non-literate or working class people than there are scribal elites. And I think there's a lot of people that want to try to have to get along, and they're just going to adopt things. I just recall when I was first learning Greek, first learning Hebrew, I used to go to the Olive Garden. I think that's the restaurant where they put down the butcher paper and they hand you the crayons and you get to write. And I would just write out the alphabet. I was still learning it, right? I would just write the alphabet over and over and over. And I didn't know all the vocabulary. I didn't know all the grammar yet, but I was learning the alphabet. And I'm sure the busser that came by at the end would look at that going, oh, either, well, this guy's a scribe, right? This guy doesn't know what the heck he's doing. One of the two. But I was learning the shapes from copying what I thought I knew, even though I was in no way a scholar at the time. So people copy these things. Little kids copy these letters. It doesn't make them a scribe, but there might be, my son watches these Japanese anime cartoons, and he's starting to copy down he has no idea what they mean, but he's writing them down, and this one looks like an A. I think I'll use this one. This one looks like a B. We see that with fonts. They're just adapting them and using them. So if they can do it now, why not at the beginning? I like the theory is what I'm saying. I guess the bigger question is, why does understanding the origin of the alphabet, how does understanding the origin of the alphabet help us better understand the Bible and ancient Israel?
Yeah, so this was kind of the main idea in my first book, The Invention of Hebrew, which was that the origins of the alphabet as a kind of low budget, kind of popular communication system that was then also taken up by scribes and maybe even captured and reused by bureaucracies, by kingdoms, by political powers, and big organizations. How does that connect to the way the Bible speaks to people? And my argument was that just as the early alphabet that turned into the Hebrew alphabet, the Aramaic alphabet, Phoenician alphabet, just as that early alphabet was kind of a more open communication system that was able to be adopted by a wide range of people and might be something that people could see as being for them. You have to remember, most writing in the ancient Near East, the vast majority of writing that we have preserved to us, is exactly as Anson Rainey, Chris Ralston, and other respected scholars argued, is for the nerds. It is writing by bureaucrats, intellectuals, and scholars. And just as important, in the Near East, usually it is in service to a kingdom or an empire. This is stuff that's being done in the palace or in the city. It's being done for the purposes of the kingdom or the state. And the thing about the spread of the alphabet is it was spread by craftspeople. It's a lot more like pottery, or fishing, sewing, one of these things. It could spread pretty far. And then at certain points it would get refined and polished up. And it's those scribes that and scholars that end up creating these early inscriptions in Phoenician, and as well as the texts we have in the Bible. But I think that the trace of the Bible's roots, the trace of the alphabet's roots that's still there, is this ability to speak to people. to speak directly to people. And the other thing, the big difference, most Near Eastern writing is only for royal courts, and it's not really in a language anyone speaks. It's in a classical school language, sort of like Latin or Sanskrit. By contrast, the Hebrew, when we first see it, first clear evidence we have of Hebrew, maybe 9th century BC, written down, this is much closer to a spoken language. It's much closer to a language that you would talk to people in, a language for a public, for a broad audience. And, whether 5% of the population could read or 10%, everybody could listen.
Right.
And so, in fact, the biblical Hebrew word for read is also the word for to call out, to summon. Kara, it's also, by the way, the source of a Hebrew word for scripture, mikra, as well as the standard Arabic word for Islamic scripture, the Quran. Same root, all those cases. Yeah. It's what is called out and recited. So unlike the way we tend to think of writing, unlike the way Babylonians would think of writing as kind of a secret code that only the highly educated could read, the word to read is also a word to call out to people.
Right.
I think that is the connection in really in one word between alphabetic writing and the ability of these biblical Hebrew texts to call out to people.
It was a common language for the people to communicate stories to one another. And it is important to note that we don't know, again, if literacy was particularly widespread. It doesn't need to be in order for the idea of writing and sharing texts to be popular. But the idea that this writing is something that should be shared or called out is a thing that you see kind of inherent in the way they talked about it. Right. That's fascinating. I had always, and taught that, you don't read silently, you're reading out loud. But the concept that the writing evolved from the fact that this was shared with the public and it wasn't that esoteric scribal, that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. You also share a lot of communication inside of your house, in your family. You are married to a scholar. What's it like being married to another scholar? And how do you balance being a scholar with raising a young family?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, the balancing part, the being married to another scholar is great because his name's Eva Mroczek. It's a Polish name, so it's hard to pronounce, but just think paycheck. But yeah, her book, The Literary Imagination in Jewish Antiquity, it's a beautiful work. It won a prize. I think it was the first ancient studies work to win a prize in book history. But I think we have a lot of conversations where we just inspire each other. The part we have to work on balancing, of course, is that in a lot of ways, it's like two people working in the same office who are married. How much of the shop talk do you bring home? Right. If there's something at work you're wound up or anxious about, do you then drag it out for another 4 hours when you're trying to wind down? So, there's some really basic work-life balance things. The plus side, I mean, there's a lot of pluses. The things that are really meaningful to me in both my personal life and scholarly life, I think I've been able to work into the family in a positive way. So our first son is named Jonas after Jonas Greenfield of blessed memory, the great Hebrew University scholar. To my mind, I'm biased, but he was the greatest scholar of Aramaic of his generation. And I had the privilege of studying with him right until he died for a year at Hebrew U. Crucial thing about Jonas Greenfield was he was just very funny. which you don't get that often in our field. People are typically very ponderous. You gotta be a little long-winded to be taken seriously. And he was just really funny. But so I was able to bring that back into our personal lives. And, the thing about, of course, raising kids also is that someone told me as a novelist, I guess, had said, well, every kid they have is a book they won't write. And at a certain point, you're like, well, okay, yep. Make sure and write the book you wanted to write. And there are these, maybe that kid will write their own books. Maybe the kid will write 5 books. Maybe the kid will do some other wonderful thing. So, okay, so you gave up a book for that. This is the kind of the essence of, I think, both parenting and then just, I don't know, working with other people or helping care for other people is, you give something up. Yeah.
I certainly found that to be the case with my 5 kids, but especially the 4 little ones that we have at home now. There's that trying to balance with, okay, I've got this space. How am I going to, go up for tenure? How am I going to do this? But then there comes that point. I always say 4 is when you can put them on autopilot. You can actually leave the bathroom and you're not worried about them, just slipping under the water and stuff. They're toilet trained. They can do things. But then, they start to write or they start to tell stories or they start to say things that I'm like, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. And they become the inspiration for other things. And yes, you have to give up things. And yes, there are moments, if we're honest, where it's like, I really would like to work on this thing, but I'm going to go play catch or I'm going to go. And then there's just a shift that happens where it's like, I'd rather be doing this anyway. This is the more important thing. And the scholarship will be there. I will talk to other scholars. I will. And I always like to ask that question of how do you balance it? Because it's a thing that I also noticed this, I noticed this, and this used to be brown and I used to have long blonde hair.
It was red.
Yeah. Right. But I wouldn't change it for the world. But I always like to ask, how do you find maybe something, a trick, maybe for other scholars that are watching this interview, something that
I actually talked with my colleague and friend Samuel Boyd, as well as another important scholar of ancient languages and the alphabet, Aaron Kohler at Yeshiva University. And we'd all been sharing, kind of commiserating this thing. They're like, well, no, you can't do as much. And you have to realize that you are taking a hit. That is an actual loss. And, it's probably better not to lie to yourself about it. And the thing I remember somebody saying, oh, well, you just become more efficient. If you only have 2.5 hours to write. And I'm like, I didn't become more efficient. I ended up quite often, I would spend those 2.5 hours, looking at guitar amplifiers on the internet. And honestly, it was only, I think after we've had our second child, who's 11 months now, and a good bit of grief that I finally was like, okay, I can do some things to make this easier for myself. I think getting in, building in like making myself exercise a little harder than I was planning to earlier in the day. And then just getting that out of the way so I could calm down. That helped a lot. And also writing bad emails, that was crucial. Yeah. I used to spend hours trying to get the nuances of an email right. And I remember some of my teachers, I'd be like, "Dear Professor Cooper, blah, 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 and the nuances, this and that." And he'd be like, "Lambert has book about it, Jay." And I'd be like, huh? But he answered the question and he answered it right away and it was done. It was off of his desk. And so writing bad emails, I mean, you got to be nice, but make them bad. That's my
correct. No, I can absolutely create a chart of when I first came to Iowa and Mac was just a little baby. I put a lot of thought into these. When the twins were born, I still tried to put a lot of effort. I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to upset anyone. We went on vacation. We came back when Judah was born. I was like, I just want to say up front that if I ever say anything that sounds short or terse or curmudgeonly, I apologize in advance. It's probably because I'm headed that direction, but I'm really not that way. I just have a lot of kids, and I'm a sweet guy. I'm trying to be friendly. It's just I don't have a lot of time, and that kind of, for most people, that kind of they accepted that, and they just want to see the kids. They don't want to see me anymore. People would just ask me. They don't ask me how I am. They don't care. They want to know about the kids. So. Tell us about your latest research. What are you working on now, just for your work and your research? And then I want to ask you a few more questions.
So the thing I'm working on now that I've been honestly is intimidating for me is getting a new perspective on how the Bible was composed, specifically the Torah or Pentateuch, or the first 5 books. Mm-hmm. This is something people have been thinking about, fighting over for 200 years. There's at least 2 schools of thought on it that totally disagree with each other. And they keep just repeating the disagreements. And so my attempt to go somewhere new on this was to be like, well, okay, let's see what they do agree on. And maybe we can picture that, conceptualize it. Because again, another typical thing in our field is people will get very intense about certain details and then go back and forth over the details, sometimes for 100 years, and not step back and say, okay, so what is this?
Right.
Can you have is this a common thing? Is it not? Is it like some other things? Is there an idea that this represents? And so I decided that instead of trying to decide whether one biblical building block or tradition was earlier, later, or the same time as another one, when we have no direct primary evidence about it, and just going around and around and around. And to be fair, there are real issues there. There are important arguments. I was like, well, what does it mean that people seem to have brought together different versions of the same story? Why would they do that? Mm-hmm. So famous thing, you just open the Bible, you read Genesis 1, an omnipotent divinity named Elohim, or God in English, creates the world purely by speaking, and he creates man and woman together as the final element, the crown of creation. Mm-hmm. And then the whole thing starts over again. Suddenly there's all the animals and plants that it said, and humans that it said were created, weren't there. And then there's this more like a guy who's in Hebrew called, Yahweh or the Lord, sometimes Yahweh Elohim, but usually just Yahweh. And he's irritable. He bumps into things. When he makes work commands, nobody listens unless he curses them. He makes everything with his hands. It makes the animals and humans with his hands suddenly. And instead of the last thing, the crown of creation, male and female together, the first animal life he creates before the animals or the woman is a man out of clay. And why would you do that? Why would you tell stories with a totally different perspective, different characters, different plots, and then they keep doing it over and over and over? The 10 Commandments are given differently. The Red Sea is crossed differently. Abraham gets different promises from God differently, and you either assume that they were just sort of dumb and just threw all their literature in a bag, and like the lottery, which is not reasonable. Or you have a bit of a conspiracy theory, like, oh, they want to make these secret arrangements based on the, Kabbalistic numerology or this. Or, and I think this is pretty reasonable, they had a different set of values than we did. They were aiming for something different. Right. And to conceptualize that, why would you tell stories that have different perspectives, sometimes clash or contradict, about gods with different names, doing kind of the same thing with most of the main characters. Another respected scholar, Yisrael Knoll at Hebrew University, had this book where he called it The Divine Symphony. And I was like, you know what? I like the idea that this is all harmonious, that everything's got its part and they all fit together. But I started studying music a few years ago as a COVID project. And the problem with a symphony is symphonies are based on like harmony, where everything has to relate in the same way. You have intervals, and if a note is a step higher or a step lower, the whole thing can sound like atonal garbage. Right. And it's like that, the Leonard Cohen song Hallelujah. He talks about how a chord progression has to work with the fourth, the fifth, the minor fall. And if instead of going from a first to a fourth to a fifth, you go from first to a second to a fifth, the whole thing sounds, again, like clashing. So this is it's not a symphony. It's like, from that point of view, it's a cacophony. Right. But there are literary values, and there are even musical values, I discovered, where there are real values that you can understand that drive a work where things are not in perfect harmony. And this is actually a very common musical value in a lot of the world. And instead of harmony or polyphony, the word is heterophony. And it's where you can hear it in some kinds of church music. You can hear it in a lot of folk music. It's when people are singing basically the same thing, but in pretty different ways. And they might start and stop at different points. They might quaver where somebody else is holding the note straight. And if a heterophony is done well, like you can hear it in a movie like Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Lonesome Valley by the Fairfield Four. It's haunting. Right. And it's haunting in a rich, complex way, an unpredictable way that's probably more powerful than music with regular harmony. And here's the other thing I can show from, again, much more direct evidence. Because people always worry, is there direct evidence of the Bible's composition? Did we find one of these sources? Well, no, we haven't. Then again, we haven't found anything in Hebrew literature from before, say 200 BC. Right. So you can't decide one way or the other based on that. But one thing, and I have an article in a Syriology journal coming out on this, but you do find Babylonian scholars arranging their scientific literature, their medical and astronomical literature, according to this value. Heterophonically, they'll have, here's an omen if there's an eclipse of the moon, and then it says the king will win, or the king will get sick. And they're clashing results, but these scholars wove them together, and they wove them into the biggest works of Babylonian scholarship. The most major and important works in Babylonian thought were not necessarily the literature. They were works of astronomy and also which they used to predict the future. So there's one famous one, Enuma Anu Enlil, 70 tablets, huge work. Mm-hmm. Enuma Anu Enlil is at a lot of points arranged heterophonically.
Fascinating. So it wasn't necessarily that the Bible or its editors, to just use a term, were trying to put together an apologetic, rational sense of it all. They may have just been taking things topically and setting them together. And it wasn't until much later that scribes came along and may have been, or editors, redactors, may have been trying to put together texts that were maybe never meant to be harmonized. Maybe these texts were never meant to be put together, but they felt they had to at a later date. But what they were originally doing early on was just putting them together by theme. These are creation texts. These are flood texts.
No, 100%. That's it. And both Baruch Schwartz at Hebrew University and Joel Baden has a really nice layout of this. The disagreement is whether that's too simple. And I think even honestly, even Schwartz and Baden would agree. At some points it is too simple. There's other kinds of harmonization, other relationships that you can also see. But the fundamental principle of organizing things by plot, by the timeline.
Yeah.
Something you can see. And to build on your point, the other thing is that if you look at what scholars call the priestly source, the source of Genesis 1, or to call it tradition, and then like famously all the descriptions of how to build the tabernacle, the laws in Leviticus have a real interest in precision, in showing concretely and exactly how you sanctify daily life, how you get in sync with the divine order. That has a theology. There's a picture of what God is like, what God wants, what you do to get in sync with God. And it has a picture of how God and human beings interacted over history. Our Bible does not have a theology. I mean, Genesis is not you might have another idea of what theology is, which is fine. But if you have an idea of theology, which is that it has a coherent picture of who God is, what God wants, how God relates to people's actions, then the irony is that the Pentateuch, as we have it, is not a theological document because it does not present a picture. It seems to present multiple pictures. And then, this great creative work that then happens once people kind of get the Bible dumped in their laps, early Jewish thinkers, early Christian thinkers, is then they rebuild a theology out of it, out of this heterophonic document.
Yeah, you remind me of the line that I always use when I teach about systematic theology and why I'm not, a fan of it at all. Systematic theology is arguing about whether lightsabers work underwater. You're talking about myths, this world that, then people argue about, this is a mythological thing, lightsabers. And then they have to say, well, we have to make it a real thing. We have to we have to expound upon these myths. And this is where all the fan fiction comes in, Jubilees and Enoch. And they've got to extrapolate this because of this priestly order. Once this has to be real, once this has to be the way that it works, now you've got to have an argument over not whether lightsabers work underwater. And they're attempting to harmonize texts that were never, ever meant to be harmonized. They were never meant to go together, but they were just arranged by topics. And now they're actually trying to make them into a rational reality when what they were stories.
Then, people got this, what I think was much more of a, how do you even describe this? A heritage, but also a kind of a speculative document, a treasury, of different things. And people were like, oh, well, how do I drive this thing? How do I make the engine work? And it's like, that's not what it was meant for.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Anyway, they somehow managed to get it on the road,
and it got picked up and it was popular. What is more important, research or let me ask it this way. What do you like doing more, research or teaching? How important is actual teaching to you?
Well, one thing I only came to understand later is that, my most popular class is on death and the afterlife. Mm-hmm. So I like the underworld stuff, slime his dominion and rot is his kingdom, of the death, divine death in ancient Canaanite. But I didn't know how I could do a class on death and the afterlife that would be really interesting, coherent, and meaningful. And honestly, I ended up putting more of my own vulnerability in it. Mm-hmm. I think I began to understand it better. To be honest, after my parents died in 2020 of old age, but still, there's no loss like that. And obviously, I didn't spend a lot of time ranting at students about my own biography because, they have their own lives and they want to learn content. the world. But I think I was informed by the fact that having to respond to death is something we all share.
Yeah.
That things like calling on the names of the dead, even in many cultures, including right here, offering food to the dead is something that is actually very easy to understand. We see it from ancient Egypt to the, ofrendas. We see roadside shrines, in many places, China, Vietnam, and that bringing in just a little bit of the spirit of my own vulnerability, as well as, and again, I wouldn't, say, oh, hey, students, you have to tell me about something incredibly terrible that happened to you when you have to do a paper on when your dog died. God forbid. But it does allow people to connect it with some of their vulnerabilities and to show. And again, since I am not a visionary mystic or preacher, I can't tell you how it really is, what the afterlife is really like, or whether there is one. But I can tell you for a fact, like a well-documented fact, it's a situation we all share. We all do stay connected to the dead, whether it is consciously or merely by avoidance, by feeling haunted, for example, or guilt. But there are really positive and animating ways to stay in touch with the dead. Again, as an example, I named my son after a really revered teacher. And I think that aspect of teaching was something I've only learned in recently, but it's an example of why it's important.
And the students respond very well when you share, when you open up and you're vulnerable and you share your personal. They respond.
Yeah, well, if it is clear that this is to help, what we're trying to do is learn about how religions and cultures have thought about and responded to death, how they've imagined it differently, and so that it's more that my teaching is informed by that this is something that we're all, going to be connected with, whether we expect it or not. And actually, I think when it's a bit more when I'm present in some way, again, not necessarily talking about, oh, my dad did this, my mom did that, but just when I'm more present, I think the class works really well. Yeah. It can be a little scary and heavy.
Sure.
So I have to watch that because it's a bit of a high wire act.
Sure.
But I think that it can be very positive and rewarding if it's done, thoughtfully and with a lot of engagement.
Yeah. So you are going to be taking your talents and your high wire act to a new position, Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia. Tell us about that. Tell us about the university and this move that you're going to be making.
Yeah. So this is something that we've been hoping to do something like this. I know that Ava, who's going to be the Spatz Chair of Jewish Studies and really spearheading a whole new initiative in Jewish studies there, has long dreamed of living in Halifax. It's not the same, but it almost has the vibe, I think, for a lot of Canadians that, I don't know, maybe like the Northwest, Pacific Northwest would have for Americans. There's lots of nature, cool stuff happening, like a little out of the way, but kind of special for being out of the way. And yeah, I'm going to be the McLeod Chair of Classics, and we're both going to be housed in the Classics program. And again, it's something that I've always kind of hoped to be part of a real ancient world program. And that's really kind of what the agenda is now. And it's happening in a number of Classics programs, that the old idea that the ancient world is pretty much what was just taught to, British boys at Eton or Cambridge in the 19th century. And it was, Pindar and Cicero and Livy. I mean, that's still there. There's a lot of that stuff is amazing. But no, this was a whole world that was tied together As my colleague Josephine Quinn, the classicist, has a book coming out called How the World Made the West, rather than How the West Made the World.
Right.
And it's a nice shift that it's the interconnections that made it. The Greeks themselves, said, yeah, we learned to write from the Phoenicians. There's a lot of direct acknowledgement of this, but it's also, there's some conflict around it because sometimes there's a fantasy of a white ancient world.
Right.
These artificially bleached statues and, this kind of thing. And there are people who've been, I think, strongly criticizing that, showing, no, we need to look at the reality. A guy named Daniel Padilla-Peralta at Princeton has been really great in pushing this forward. You need to look at the reality of the world's interconnections. So my alphabet stuff is really nice here. Right. One thing I'll certainly be teaching about is this history of writing that shows how this spans the whole Mediterranean. Just as you could say that these early West Semitic speakers achieved a working misunderstanding of Egyptian to invent the alphabet, so people all over the Mediterranean, not just on Greek islands, but also, for example, Phrygians, adapted the alphabet really early to write down their own local spoken languages. And this was kind of a pan-Mediterranean thing. And I think that you can see the history of writing, the history of media, much more clearly if it is a more global history.
Yeah, and I agree with you. That's exactly what we're doing here at the University of Iowa. The classics department is now where we're doing all of the biblical studies, late antiquity, all the Semitic languages, plus Greek and Latin in the same way, to have a broader understanding, not just geographically, but diachronically, of what the classics are. This is basically ancient civilizations, ancient world. And I'm a big proponent of that. And so I like to hear that other programs are embracing this as well, especially with a growing, and you're going to be founding a Jewish studies program, Semitic studies, correct?
Yeah. I mean, we actually already had one incredibly strong Semiticist, my new colleague, Sasha Traeger, who's the world's expert interestingly, on Christian Arabic literature, because there's a huge amount of Christian literature in medieval Arabic. So he was already a top Semitist. We already have some excellent colleagues who teach this, but I'm the first kind of Bible and ancient Near East person who's 100% in that. Ava was the first early Jewish studies person who's 100% that.
Oh, that'll be great. That'll be wonderful. Congratulations on the new positions. Good luck on the move. The boys will absolutely enjoy living in nature, and I am jealous. I think I told you my wife is very jealous of this move. We will want to come visit as soon as you guys all get moved in. Seth Sanders, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. It's wonderful to get to hear about what you've done, what you will be doing, and of course, just to learn about a fascinating individual like you. Thank you again for taking the time.
Well, thank you so much, Bob, for and for sharing this with with the world. And yeah, we would love to have you. We'll show you the splendors, the various sea creatures and stuff of Nova Scotia, and we will definitely have space. So yeah, we would love to.
No, we'll be happy to come and visit. And for all of you, thank you for tuning in. And I'm Dr. Bob Cargill, wishing you everything the best.